welcome you to the Dr. Warren Gage podcast, and we're beginning a new series today. It will be a little bit shorter than would be projected by the length of the book I want to turn our attention to. That's the book of Job. I don't believe I've ever recorded, other than a couple of chapters, anything on this book. I've been hesitant to turn to it because Job's three friends, his so-called comforters, speak extensively about God and theology, and much of it sounds correct, but God himself says they spoke wrongly. In fact, it was sinfully. They had spoken about him, and Job has to offer sacrifices on their behalf for God to forgive them. So that doesn't sound like a very sound theological basis for approaching that part of the text. I feel much more confidently about speaking about what Job himself says. So that will narrow the scope of this very large book quite a bit. I want to look particularly at the context within the scripture of what Job is saying and what he himself says, because we are told that we can rely upon that. And I think it's a challenging book in many ways, but I think it'll reward our efforts. And so I want to just jump right in and see what we can say with some confidence. But in order to do that, I want to put it in its context biblically. And we do have a divine commentary on Job given to us in the book of James. So I want to begin actually with that because it sets the context for the whole book. And that's found in the section that begins in verse 7 in James 5. And he will mention Job by name, by specific reference, and so that's significant. One of the canons of understanding what is in fact Holy Scripture is what New Testament book alludes to. Does it quote one of the books of the Jewish canon, or does it name it or the author? And this one, in fact, is named by the Apostle James, which is part of our understanding of why it should be included within the canon. So James writes in chapter 5, verse 7, and the translation is really, it should be probably, be therefore long-suffering. I think that's more to the sense of the macrothumia word. It can be translated patient, and patience is usually a word we think of in terms of time, but it has to do with enduring suffering too. And so there are a number of words here, but long-suffering, be long-suffering. I think that in light of the suffering before glory paradigm is probably more capturing the force of macrothumia, or its verbal form here. Be long-suffering, therefore, brothers. So he's writing to fellow Christians, until the coming, the presence of the Lord. So this life is viewed, in one sense, as suffering that will not culminate until Christ returns. And so I think we can all understand that. And he gives illustrations. He says, behold, the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth in long suffering over it until he receives both the early and the latter rains. Now, the Bible speaks of the early rains and the latter rains. That's often misunderstood. Israel is semi-tropical, which means that it rains half the year. The rains usually begin in October or early November, and they continue until March or April. And the rains are during the entire winter season, so from October to April. At any time it can rain in Israel because the prevailing winds come off of the Mediterranean Sea, and they're heavy with moisture laden with rain. And so the rainy season is half the year, running from the fall to the springtime. So it's not like latter rains are identified with something eschatological. It's seasonal in Israel. And the summer months are dry. You can see that in the tourist pictures that are brought back. If the trips are taken in the summertime, everything is beige and nondescript, brown, because it's the dry season. But if you make your trip in the wintertime, you'll see the land is covered with wildflowers and it's green. The pastures are green. The tropical areas down by the Jordan are filled with bougainvilleas and all kinds of gorgeous, gorgeous plants. And that begins with the rainy season. In the springtime, the winds shift from coming off the Mediterranean to coming off the Jordanian desert, and everything dries up and dies overnight. And so it's a very dramatic contrast between life and death in the seasons of winter and summer in Israel as it was experienced. The wind coming off of the east is called the Ruach HaKadim, the eastern wind in Hebrew, but the Arabs call it the Kasdim, because those winds begin and endure for about 50 days, which is what that word means, Kasdim. 50 days of the dry wind blowing, and everything dries up and dies. And that figure of speech is used a number of times in the Bible. One of them is Isaiah 40, where he talks about the grass grows and the generations of man are likened to the grass. The grass will flourish and the flower will grow up and be fragrant and beautiful, but delicate and fragile. But the wind of the Lord, he calls it the breath of the Lord, will blow upon it, and the flower will fall and the grass will wither. And that becomes a figure of speech for mortality. But in the context of that, in Isaiah 48, he says, but the Lord will arise, using the language of resurrection, forever. And so he speaks of the mortality of man, and Christ, when he is born, is mortal. That is, he's capable of dying. There is no sin in him, which means he would not ordinarily die. He was not subject to that. Sin is the wages of death, or death is the wages of sin. And there was no sin in him, so he could go for 40 days and 40 nights without eating and drinking and not perish. But when our sin was imputed to him, he became capable of dying. And so, and he did. But he cannot remain in the state of death. Death has no power over him because he is also immortal God. And so he would arise. And that's the background of Isaiah's great statement about Christ's mortality and divinity. So the farmer will plant, and he will see that God gives increase during the winter season, and that he calls it the precious fruit of the earth will be born and harvested. And he must remain long-suffering until he receives the early and the latter rains. That is, he suffers through the summer season when nothing will grow, in hope that God will bring the rain, which he does seasonally, the refreshing rains. So he says, also you be long-suffering, like this farmer, in expectation that God will return the fertile years, the fertile times, the fertile seasons. He says, establish your hearts because of the presence of the Lord, and that is coming near. He says, do not complain or murmur, brothers, against one another, lest you be judged. Behold, the judge is before the door. He's standing before the door, and imminently he will return. So he's encouraging us to persevere in the sufferings, the seasons of infertility that we have. And he says, as an example, brothers, take the suffering, the long suffering, and the suffering of evil of the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. The prophets endured tremendous suffering in this life. They spoke of all of the sufferings of judgment that would fall upon the nations and upon Israel. But they always turn, the prophets do, after speaking of judgment, to talk about the comfort that God is going to bring when he comes to receive us. So Isaiah, for example, Isaiah 1 through 36 is all about the judgments he's about to pour out on Israel and the nations. you've got the historical interlude from 36 to 39, and then in 40, the prophet looks to the coming of Christ and he says, comfort ye my people, speaking of the Lord to the people of God. Take comfort, he is coming and you will see him, and we need to prepare his way. So that idea that suffering will be rewarded with glory is fundamental to the whole prophetic voice. In the Old Testament and the New Testament, Christ speaks of it in his discussion with the two disciples from Emmaus in Luke 24. Was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and then to enter into his glory? And that's the pattern of God from the very beginning. When he brings suffering into our lives, there's a purpose to it. It's the womb of faith. When we suffer, we trust that God will deliver us, whether it's in this life or he will deliver us through the trials of this life, or even through death itself. He will deliver us and bring refreshment and glory. And so James is appealing to that pattern that's as old as the scriptures, and as clearly taught in Moses and all the prophets as Christ described to his Emmaus disciples. So that same pattern we find throughout the whole of the Bible. And he says, behold, we count those blessed who endure, who remain under. This is the key word, hupomeno. Those who remain under, they stand, they abide under the afflictions that pour over them. And he says, you have heard of the hupomene, the endurance of Job. You heard of it, and of the end that the Lord, that he saw in the Lord, that very compassion is of the Lord and merciful. He says, you've heard of the steadfastness, the perseverance of Job, who suffered all of these many things, many afflictions. And you've seen the purpose of the Lord, and this is his conclusion of the purposes of those sufferings of Job that were unendurable, actually, almost unendurable. How the Lord is compassionate and merciful. At the end, everything is restored to Job that was taken away from him. Now that gives us some perplexity, as we'll talk about. He's given double everything that he had in property. You can understand that, but his children that are taken away, he's given more children at the end. And children are not fungible. You can't precisely replace them as completely and fully, because he dearly loved his family. So there are complexities in the mind of God and our understanding of it, but James is assuring us that God is good and his purposes are merciful. And we need to keep that in mind in the context of Job as we understand it. He's giving us a summary of the whole thing. You have heard, he says, of the perseverance, I think is probably the best word, the perseverance of Job in all of his suffering, and how he learned at the end, the telos, the end of all of that, is that the Lord is very compassionate, multi-compassionate, and merciful. And so that will be the lesson. If we understand Job correctly, we will come to those conclusions that God's end, his purpose, is not to discover so much Job as it is to show himself being merciful and compassionate. And so if we come to those conclusions, I think this is our divine commentary on Job. We will do well. So let's turn our attention now to the book of Job itself, precisely. And we'll have to make some introductory comments about it as well. The book of Job. There was a man in the land of Uz. We don't know who wrote this book. It just begins. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. Now, Uz is referred to in the Bible, one of the sons of Aram, which would tend to locate it in the north of Israel, in the Syria area. But it is also identified with Edom, and that would be in the south. And so, where is this place? It was known in the days of Moses. He describes it at the beginning of Deuteronomy. But we have no idea where Uz was, as a friend of mine once said. Where was Uz? We have no idea where the land of Uz was. A colleague of mine at seminary wrote his thesis, his master's thesis, and that was his title, Where Was Uz? I didn't think that sounded as pretentious as maybe it should, but anyway, it was an intriguing title, Where Was Uz? And in reflecting on it, we really don't know. And so I think we have to conclude that, and I think that that's deliberate, by the way. Whose name was Job. And who is Job? He is not Israel, although he knows the tetragrammaton name. He knows the name of the Lord. But he's not, as far as we can tell, he doesn't have anything to do with Israel. And so, when is he? We don't know that either. It seems to be very ancient, the book. And most commentary, older commentary, thought it was very ancient. But we don't know. It doesn't situate itself in the life of Israel or in the history of redemption clearly for us. All of his friends seem to be Gentile who come to him. He seems to be Gentile himself. So what does that mean? Well, I think what that means is we don't know where he is or when he is. The book was thought to be very ancient. In fact, some people have suggested it's the oldest book in the Bible. Not sure I can agree with that. One of the reasons is because the primary antagonist is named Satan. And Satan, the adversary, is a late name. You only find that attested in later Hebrew. And so that would argue for a later date, the earliest date possibly during the time of Solomon. It's also usually been identified with wisdom literature. But the bottom line is we don't know where he was, and we don't know when he was. And I suspect that that's deliberate. Why? Because the theme of the book is how do we address ourselves to the sufferings of this life? And that theme is universal. And so anybody picking up this book, which is not situated in space or time, anybody reading this book can identify with its main theme. So I suspect that that's deliberate. But that doesn't help us to locate the book, although it helps us to understand its theme and its universality and why it speaks to us. And if we can understand how Job addresses himself, who is extraordinarily righteous. I don't know of anyone in the Bible that comes off quite like him, although he is not sinless. But there is hardly anyone apart from Christ that comes off as maintaining his integrity through, this incredible trial that he will go through. He certainly speaks of Christ in that. And James can hold him up to the people of God as an example of persevering faith. So anyway, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was blameless and upright, and one who feared God and shunned evil. This language is used of Noah, too, who was blameless and upright. And yet his sin is very graphically depicted in his sin in Genesis 9. His drunkenness and immorality in the tent. So these statements are made, but we must understand them as being relative. They're not absolute. They're only absolute with respect to Christ, who was absolutely blameless and upright, who feared God and shunned evil and never partook of evil. But we have to understand this commendation as being relative to the nature of fallen mankind. He is one like us. In fact, he will confess at the end. He will confess that, and when he closes his mouth, he says he has nothing to say. He knows that God is righteous. In fact, he knows that all the way through. He wrestles with understanding how God can be compassionate and merciful, like James says, but he always knows that God at the end is going to demonstrate himself to be such, even though Job can't see it. And so he wrestles with the here and now, even as we do, and not completely successfully, so much like us as well. He was blameless and upright, and one who feared God and shunned evil. That's quite a commendation, and it's in Holy Scripture. And 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him, and that's a full quiver in the Bible. The 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. That's a position of tremendous blessing, so he is very much enriched in his family. And his possessions were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a very large household, so that this man was the greatest of all the people in the East. So there again, we're not located or situated within the context of Israel at all. It's he's the greatest man in the East. That's a phenomenal number of animals, and animals are pecunia, I think, is the Latin term for money, and it has to do with cattle. And in the ancient world, your wealth was often seen in your flocks and your herds, and he has 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels. That means he was exporting and importing quite a bit, obviously. So there's usually a lot of wealth accumulation in that kind of an emporium. 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a very large household. So that this man was the greatest of all the people in the East. So he was well known, and his piety would have been well known and was well known. We know that from his friends who come to comfort him. And his sons would go and feast in their houses, each on his appointed day, and would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with him. Well, what is the appointed day? The appointed day is clearly the birthday. This is a family that celebrates life, and they enjoy one another's company. They all get along, which is unusual, but they had an incredible father, I think we can say that. But they all get along, and they celebrate life. They celebrate their birthday. That's a time of feasting in the family, and so they have many of them. They get together on these appointed days, and they would eat and drink with them, which is, of course, festivity. So it was, when the days of feasting had run their course, that Job would send and sanctify them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. This is a father's love. I think in the modern age it would be reflected in prayer. But in the ancient times, obviously he understands this sacrificial system. Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel knew the sacrificial system, so that would have been common to mankind. But when the days of feasting had run their course, that he would send and sanctify them, and would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus Job did regularly. Job knew the temptations of life, and the temptation of life is to curse God. By the way, I should say something about this, because all the way through, when we read the word curse, the Hebrew text is actually bless. And that's, a professor used to call that Semitic polarity. They hesitated to use the word cursing with God, and so they would say blessing when they actually meant cursing, as we'll see. And so the English text is rendering it accurately, but it's not literal. But there are reasons for that. They don't even want to mention cursing in the company of the name of the Lord. And we know that in the Old Testament, the name of the Lord was held so sacred. They would not say Ehya, which is God's proper name. They would say Yahweh, which is, he is not I am, it's he is. So they're using all of these circumlocutions to make sure that they're not transgressing the commandment that protects the name of God. And so Job says, it may be that my sons have sinned and blessed God, but he means cursed God, in their hearts. Thus Job did regularly. So he's regularly covering for all of his family by sacrifice. He knows that young people have a tendency to sin. He doesn't know of anything directly, but he says they might have done this in their hearts, which itself is sinful. And so he recognizes that we have to have integrity of confession and heart. And that will be the great test with which he himself will be confronted, as we will see. Now there came a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came among them. This is the sons of God seems to be a term that has to do largely with angels. And so Satan is in that company, and so he's presenting himself before God. That Satan has regular access to the courts of heaven seems to be the case. In Revelation, only when you come to Revelation 12 is Satan cast out of heaven. And he's called the accuser of the brethren. And there is some rejoicing that he is cast out of heaven, no longer to be able to accuse the brethren. And that seems to reflect what his role is here. He's coming to bring to mind the sinfulness of mankind that God is determined to save. That is a marvel to the angels, because mankind in general is regarded as a lower order of creation. But for the angels, and they too had sin in their number, it's estimated, based on Revelation 12, that 1/3 of the angel company did not keep their first estate, if we can conflate the language of Jude, but fell. And so the rest of the angels, Paul calls them calls them the elect angels. So there were some that were chosen for life, but there was never any plan of salvation for the angels, which is an amazing thing. That's why the angels marvel that God would save mankind, because he is a lower order of creation. So the two cherubim angels that are represented on the top of the ark are looking at wonder, not at each other, which you would normally think because of their beauty, but they're looking down at the top of the box of the ark, which is called the mercy seat. And they're marveling that God would make a provision for the redemption of man. And in fact, he makes that redemption in his own blood, which they marvel at and understand. So the sons of God are appearing before the court of heaven and appearing before God, and Satan also came among them. So we've shifted now from looking at the family of Job to the heavenly courts. And all of the drama of this world is seen in the context of the contest of heaven. And so the Lord said to Satan, "From where do you come?" And Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking back and forth on it." So he has come to heaven, but his general presence is on the earth, where he walks to and fro, walking back and forth on it. And that reminds us of the description of Satan that we find in 1 Peter 5:8, where the apostle says that your enemy, your adversary, like a roaring lion, goes to and fro, seeking whom he may devour. And I think Peter is deriving that idea from this passage. He's saying, Satan answered and said, "From going to and fro in the earth, and from walking back and forth on it." And he comes with an accusation against everyone, and particularly Job, as we will see. Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job?" And that's the highest accolade, the highest praise. My servant is my slave, my bondslave, my servant. Job, have you considered him? He challenges Satan, that there is none like him on the earth. That is, he is the chief example of the blessed life. There is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil. That's quite a commendation coming from God himself, who knows all things. And he holds up Job as an example of the faithful. So Satan answered the Lord and said, "Does Job fear God for nothing?" And so right away we see the nature of his craftiness. He's going to undermine Job and say that he's a fraud, he's a hypocrite. He walks uprightly because he recognizes that that's the shortest route to blessing. And that's the reason, that's the true motivation of his inner heart. Have you not made a hedge around him? That is, to protect him. A hedge protects from the wind and from strangers. The paradise idea is always hedged in, like the garden. Have you not made a hedge around him, around his household, and around all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. So there you are. He serves you because you protect him. You serve him, actually. Then he says, "But now stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." And of course the language is he will bless you, but actually clearly in the context, what Satan is suggesting is if you touch all of his property and take that away from him, he will curse you to your face. That's pretty bold. He will curse you to your face. My goodness. And that, of course, will be his temptation, as we will see. And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your power. Only do not lay a hand on his person," on him. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. He has his commission. He can do anything he wants. And we can see his implacable hatred of mankind. This man is innocent. He has harmed no one. And yet he's going to suffer superlatively more than any other, apart from Christ, it seems to me. So the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your power. Only do not lay a hand on his person," that idea of laying a hand on him. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. So we're about to have a contest. Now we should bear in mind that the sacred writer is pulling the curtain back to show us what's going on in heaven, but there's no indication that Job is aware of any of this at all. He's living his life one day at a time in the continuity of enjoying the continuity of the blessing of God, which comes upon him for his obedience. But the question is, will he have that same obedience when the days of adversity come? Now there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. So this is one of those festival days, those birthdays. They are celebrating life, and they're celebrating the life of his eldest son. And a messenger came to Job and said, "The oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them when the Sabaeans raided them." These are historical enemies, and so the Sabaeans raided them and took them away. Indeed, they have killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. So that's a very heavy message. Job has been severely damaged in his property. The oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them when the Sabaeans raided them and stole them away. Indeed, they have killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. So the first messenger brings word that his property has been severely impaired and damaged by the Sabaeans. And this messenger comes with this statement, "I alone have escaped to tell you," which is interesting, as we will see. And while he was still speaking, another also came and said, so the second of Job, there will be four, second of Job's messengers, he came and said, "The fire of God fell from heaven," that is lightning, a storm of lightning, fell from heaven, and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. So he hears one message, and on the heels of that message being delivered comes another messenger, and he has a similar message, only this time it is not historic enemies. It is a natural enemy. The fire of God, lightning most likely, fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. So Satan is engineering this whole incident, and one blow upon another is how it will be worked out, and only one will escape to tell Job of the disaster that has come upon his house. While he was still speaking, another also came and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 bands, raided the camels, and they triangulated them, made a cauldron, raided the camels and took them away, yes, and killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. Now these would be, his servants here are the ones that over his great wealth generator, these camels. The Chaldeans have come, and they took them away, so there's no chance of recovery. And they kill the servants with the edge of a sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. So each one of them, in an unplanned manner, has been reporting the same thing. One messenger escapes and tells him about these things. The first told about historic enemies, the Sabaeans. The second one told him about natural enemy, that is the lightning, fire from heaven. The third now tell him about another historic enemy, the Chaldeans, which puts it in the eastern area. It's not in the land of Israel. It's really more in the eastern Mesopotamian area. And that he alone had escaped, so he's got these 3 messengers, and while he was still speaking, another also came. And this is the heaviest blow of all, and the culminating blow. Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and suddenly a great wind came from across the wilderness. So this is a natural enemy, the wind that came, the windstorm. It struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they are dead, and I alone have escaped to tell you. So Job has heard these 4 messengers in sequence coming. Now he is a wise man of the East, and so he can detect patterns. They're pretty evident when you look at them. The first enemy, or the Sabaeans, are historic enemies. Those are people. The second is the fire falling from heaven, and so it's a natural enemy that comes, that takes away even yet another part of his estate. And while he was speaking, another enemy came, a messenger came and said the Chaldeans, who are historic enemies, came, and they did further damage to his property. And then while he was speaking, he said, your sons and daughters, his family, those for whom he was sacrificing continually, came, and a wind came, suddenly a great wind came from across the wilderness that struck the 4 corners of the house. So Job will see that there's a sequence here, and there's a pattern to these messengers. The pattern is evident in that one follows immediately upon the other. So there are 4 messengers coming, and the 4 together will be describing the complete destruction of everything that is dear to him. All of it has been destroyed. The only thing that hasn't been destroyed is the person of Job himself, whom God had forbidden the enemy to touch. And so he sees the pattern in it, that one disaster happens after another. They occur in the pattern of a historic enemy, then a natural enemy, a historical enemy, and a natural enemy. That sequence is significant as well to detect the pattern of it, so that patterns suggest purpose and intention. So there's clearly an intention, and the intention is coming from heaven. Ultimately, the timing of it and the climactic nature of it, it's touching him in every area of his livelihood, but then the most climactic of all is when he loses his children. And so he's aware of all of that. He sees the pattern in it, and ultimately the only conclusion that he can draw, logical conclusion, is that God has done this to him. Now, why would God do that to him? He's continually serving God. He's giving God the glory. He's honoring God. He's known as being blessed by God. Why would God bring these curses upon him? Why would he do that? He recognizes immediately that it has come from God. It's not something that is random, as we would say. Nothing is, but he doesn't see anything that he can attribute it to other than the pattern, suggesting that God himself is judging his house. And he's even careful to offer sacrifices on behalf of his children, lest they would have secretly sinned against God and cursed him in their hearts. So have the sacrifices meant nothing, as all of that he's given his time and attention to meant nothing to him. And so anyway, then Job arose and tore his robe. The continual, he's divesting himself. It's like the high priest, when he hears blasphemy, would tear his robe. It's that universal gesture of being utterly distraught at the news that has come. He shaved his head, that too, and he fell to the ground and worshipped. Now, that's unexpected. The shaving of the head is a mourning gesture. He tore his robe. The robe would declare his status and station, and that's gone. And he shaved his head. He's in mourning. And he fell to the ground. That's not the place where a man of Job's stature should be found. But then the key word is he worshipped. And that's absolutely stunning. That's a showstopper. He worshipped. Why would he worship? Why wouldn't he just cry out in an anguish that could be utterly inexpressible? Why wouldn't he express great doubt? He falls down and worships God. I think that's truly remarkable. That's like Christ. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. The trust that's implied in that is Christ-like, truly. And then he spoke and he said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there." Now, that's what the text literally says. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I return there. Many modern translators wrongly, severely wrongly in my opinion, will say, "And naked I will return." They speak of his death, clearly. But he doesn't say that. He says, "Naked I will return there." The "there" is usually what bothers them, because they make it sound like Nicodemus. "How can I, being old," Nicodemus said to Christ when told he had to be born again, "enter into my mother's womb?" Misunderstanding Jesus altogether. But that's what Job is saying. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. Why is that significant? It's clear he's speaking of life and death. The beginning of life is when he was born in his mother's womb. He came into this world with nothing. And he understands that the nature of mankind is that we leave the world with nothing, too. But when he says, "Naked I shall return there," it's actually a word of great faith. He came naked from his mother's womb, and naked he will return there. What that means is he's returning to the womb of his mother, which is Mother Earth, which is the womb of mankind. He knows the story of Adam. God created Adam of the dust of the ground. And so, and then he was told in his judgment that he would return to the ground. Dust you are, and to dust you shall return. But understanding that in the faith, to return to the womb, that is to be buried in the earth, which is the mother of man, that ultimately speaks of the possibility of new birth and a new creation. And Job already understands that very clearly. "Naked I came from my mother's womb. I didn't bring anything into this world. I surely will take nothing out of this world. But the tomb that I will return to is the womb of my original mother," not his natural mother, but his original mother. And that's where he will await resurrection. Paul uses the same theological reasoning in Romans chapter 8 when he says, describing the great resurrection of the last day, he says, the earth, the ancient womb of man, is in labor and travail. He applies the aspects of childbirth to the earth itself, which groans as part of the creation and the curse that was placed upon the earth. It groans to give birth to the children of God that are now gestating in the womb of the earth. Amazing poetic vision here. What he's saying is that when we die, we return to the earth, but we're returning to the womb. The tomb becomes the womb in Christian theology, as it was for Christ, who in his aspect as the new Adam had to come forth from the earth, which he does in resurrection, not in his natural birth, but in his resurrection he came forth from the womb of man, from the earth. And so Job is saying in this tremendous statement of faith, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. And that's the way it should be translated. He says, the Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. And then he says, blessed be the name of the Lord. He blesses God. He worships God. He accepts what has happened at the good hand of God, although he doesn't understand it at all. But he's the pattern. This is the pattern of the patience of Job that James was talking about, that we should, in the attitude that we should have as well. Whatever we have in this life, we hold loosely, because God can take it away, and death certainly will take it away. But we trust that God is gracious and merciful, as we learn with Job, and that all things will be restored to us in that day. It's a marvelous statement. One of the greatest, grandest statements of faith that I can imagine in all of the Bible. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. He understands all of this came from the hand of God. He can see by reason. He can see in the pattern of the messengers that came and the way they came, all singularly at the end of these disasters, one on the heels of the other, that there was intention behind those messengers. And ultimately, he knows that God is sovereign over all things, and so God has purposed this. He has no idea why God has purposed this, but he accepts that he has, and he falls down and worships God. It's a tremendous statement of faith. Outside of Christ, I don't know of any greater. You have heard, as James says, of the patience, of the suffering of Job in faith. And this is what he's saying. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. It's not Satan. He says the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And in all this, the sacred writer writes, Job did not sin, nor charge God with wrong. It's an amazing statement of his confidence, his faithful confidence in God's goodness that cannot be overthrown by the loss of everything he has. Marvelous statement. What an aspiration. And what a rebuke of Satan. So we'll see Satan again as he comes for his second attack in chapter 2. Thank you for listening. Please be sure to like and subscribe to my channel if this has been useful to you or intriguing. To learn more, you can visit my webpage, drwarrengage.com, or find me on my Patreon account, patreon.com/Dr. Warren Gage. I hope you'll join me next time on the Dr. Warren Gage podcast. Thank you.